Having demonstrated that a being like that exists, it cannot fail to be present in the world today. That means that this being also exists now. It couldn't cease to exist. Now, that still leaves open the question of deism. Has this creator and designer of the universe, perfectly good, revealed himself to us in some way that we can know him more personally? Or has he remained aloof and distant from the world that he's made? That's still an open question to talk about.
Yeah, deism becomes an option when you don't start with Scripture, and Dr. Craig feels it is a very, very unwise thing to start there.
The question as to which of these is true, I think, stands or falls upon the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was? Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God, and I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true.
Now, let me just point out, I'll say it again, Dr. Craig adopts the New Testament documents as generally reliable historical works perspective. And I just simply have to point out to you that if they are just generally reliable historical documents, then when our Muslim friends try to poke holes in them by positing self-contradiction within them, is mere general accuracy enough to substantiate something as amazing as claiming that God himself entered into human flesh? That's really the question.
And that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus.
Or I would say when you allow all of the New Testament to speak, even within its religio-historical context. But I would say there is a consistent revelation, and it's inspired, and it comes from God concerning who Jesus is. So that means I don't get to pick and choose which parts of the New Testament I'm going to allow to speak to this. If you're just looking at the New Testament as generally reliable, why do you insist that the portions you're going to focus upon are the primary ones and not what someone else might focus upon? I think they all have to be harmonized because of the nature of the text. If you don't think that, if you've already abandoned that high level of the view of Scripture, or just don't think it's defensible, or you can get to it later on, you don't have the same foundation I do to demand the consistency of looking at all of what Scripture says. And how many times in our debates over the years has it come down to allowing Scripture to define the parameters of who Jesus is? Our Muslim friends will pick certain verses and ignore other certain verses. Now, the Unitarians will do the same thing. And we say, no, you've got to listen to all of it. Well, there's something behind that. And the behind that is the inspired, supernatural consistency of a divine revelation that is intended to communicate something to us. If you start off by saying, we can skip that,
I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus.
Among the what? Let me.
I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus.
Who gets to determine that once you have decided that you're not even going to defend the integrity of all of those words? Why do you defend just certain portions of those words?
Were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel.
Now, when it says that he was different from other kings and things like that as the Son of God, again, that requires a pan-canonical, all the way across the canon consistency in the definition of what Son of God means. And once you've bought the mainly reliable, not going to defend the consistency part, how can you? He's assuming what he's not willing to defend. and evidently hoping people won't see that.
To whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?"
And I agree 1,000%. This is central to an identification of Jesus' self-understanding of himself. But if the words he's quoting aren't inspired, if the record we have is not inspired, it's insufficient to substantiate the claim that you're making based upon it. It just is.
And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense.
No one says that it is. It was certainly dangerous in the socio-political context of the day. The Sadducees didn't want anybody doing that. The Sadducees had a vested interest in getting rid of anybody who claimed that particular phraseology. But no one's arguing that the point of blasphemy was the utilization of the coalescence of Psalm 110 and Daniel together that you get in Jesus' words.
Even that, there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope.
Prior visions, because your intertestamental literature, the literature written between Malachi and Matthew, in that Second Temple period up to the destruction in AD 70, shows not a monolithic understanding of the Messiah. There's certainly very highly politicized examples of that. But there were other viewpoints of the Messiah that are very, very interesting, but it wasn't just one view.
Of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that'd be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely...
It's an oddity. Well, I'm not sure what an oddity is in that context. It certainly is not part of what would be expected by especially the Jewish leaders in their viewpoint. That doesn't change the fact that Jesus made these claims concerning himself, and the reaction of the Jewish leaders is fully understandable and is consistent with how they would have understood things at that particular time in that particular place in history.
Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead.
That's certainly central. I'm not going to dispute that, but I don't think that's the only ground. The Jewish understanding of the Messiah was to be primarily developed in that intertestamental period, and we would not give specific authority to the writings that enshrined those views. And Jesus very often, the Messianic secret in the gospel ministry, things like that, all goes to his dealing with that particular issue. So anyway.
Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal.
I caught that the first time through. That's not something I would have done. Talking with a Jew and using the divine name. It's unnecessary throwing of gasoline in that particular context. But anyway.
Vindication of the man whom the chief priest had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection,
I think it's a valid argument. The empty tomb validates all of Jesus' claims. No choice about it.
Why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why.
Now, did you catch that? Why is resurrection proof of divinity? It's not proof of divinity directly. As he says, Lazarus was raised from the dead. That doesn't make Lazarus God. It's very common for both Jews and Muslims to misunderstand the nature of what makes the resurrection so important. It's the fact that Jesus prophesied it, said how he was going to die, said that he was going to be buried, he was going to rise again the third day, and that the New Testament scriptures assign the responsibility for having done that to the Father, to the Spirit, and even to the Son. He takes his own life back again. So it's a Trinitarian act. So it's not just merely experiencing resurrection, but having prophesied it and said that it is due to the fact of my unique relationship to the Father, which comes out in John chapter 14.
I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs.
Or maybe the prophecies about it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. That seems to have been Jesus's primary concern as to the interpretation of the miracle of the resurrection. Was he said to disciples, "Why are you so slow of heart to believe what has been said to me from Moses through all the prophets?" That part's, I think, really important.
And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the Gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that...
Now, so what Ben is saying is if you take the later date for the writing of the Gospels, I would put Mark before 70. All the Gospels could be before 70. It doesn't change anything if any of them are post, but I think the synoptics are plainly pre-70. If they were post-70, they wouldn't say the things that they say the way they say it. John could be post-70 without any problem one way or the other, but people argue about that too. We don't have a date on it, but the point is, when you really think about it, is the general, the claim that these are generally reliable historical documents. Yeah, but they're relating something that isn't just simply a matter of simple history. It transcends the categories of history. It's a massively supernatural miracle. And so you need something a little bit more than, well, hey, it was the Jerusalem Post for that day. That's good enough. It's generally good, except the advice column and the gossip column. And no, there's something different about these documents.
In order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
So it's like Bill Craig has a allergy to the term inerrant. For it to be accurate, it doesn't have to be inerrant. Maybe there's some stuff there. Maybe the writers didn't just quite get it all right. But again, this is not how the apostles would have responded to that kind of an objection by any stretch of the imagination.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts.
So here come the minimalist facts for the resurrection argument. We've heard it over and over and over and over again, but here they come. And if this is such a great approach, this will probably result in Ben Shapiro's conversion,
which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today.
There's the argument from scholarly authority. It's always snuck in there.
Who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary.
So there's your minimalist facts. It used to be like 5, but now it's been, make this as narrow as you possibly can, makes it more defensible.
The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example,
just ordinary historical documents, no inspiration. Gets that's very, very important. Even though the one who rose from the dead, the first thing he did with his disciples was to talk about the inspired documents and the prophets and stuff like that. But we've grown past that, I guess. I don't know.
That the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead.
Evidently, the quote-unquote radical scholars are just simply being dismissed here as nobody. Dr. Price certainly questions all of these things, but I guess they don't exist.
So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So there's the argument. It's not an inspired word from God, but it's better than anything else, which of course means you get to make that judgment. You get to make that judgment. It's all up to you. When Paul went to Mars Hill, he actually skipped all that and said, God's going to judge you by the one he raised from the dead, whether you believe he did or not. And I'm not inviting you to analyze various theories about it. I am telling you what the reality is going to be. But, Paul hadn't had the chance to think these things through to the level that we have today. And so, we're dealing with such skeptical people. Well, and people at Mars Hill were too. But anyway, we just do things differently today is basically what you've got going there.